Looking down the long, dimly lit hall, I wanted to turn around and run. I don't belong here. This is a place for criminals, for people with no morals, I thought to myself. As I heard the metal door clang shut behind me, I shuddered. I'd be out in a few hours. It was just a visit. All things I told myself as I followed the guard in front of me. I could hear the jeers and catcalls of the prisoners as I passed their barred windows, and immediately wished I'd worn anything but the pencil skirt and blazer I was in at the moment. I had forgotten I was going to be surrounded by animals. We made our way down the hallway to another thick steel door at the other end. The guard pressed his badge to a scanner next to the door, entered a code into the keypad, and I heard the lock click open. He turned and gestures for me to enter, and after a moment of hesitation, I did. I stepped forward cautiously and found myself in the most stereotypical interrogation room I had ever seen, minus the two-way mirror, for reasons I could only imagine. The walls were solid, cold concrete, and a fluorescent ceiling light flickered just enough to irritate me. It wasn't the room that demanded my attention, though. It was the man chained to the table in the middle. I was face to face with Barton Shepard, the most prolific serial killer of the century. With over 50 confirmed murders, he put the Zodiac to shame. His trial had been all over the news, and despite his protest of innocence, he was sentenced to death about 10 years ago. Now, his time was nearly up. Through my dedication and knowledge of his case, I was able to work my way into this interview. I'm the journalist who had been covering his case from the start. Foul play wasn't even suspected in his first kill, but I knew better. I had a nose for this stuff, and investigated it myself. Sure enough, another woman turned up dead a week later, and eventually, it became the stuff of nightmares for our county. For 8 months, he went around without being caught, killing women he met on dating sites, specifically married women. Classic, right? It amazed me it took so long for law enforcement to connect the dots. But I guess, in the age of endless likes combined with the fact that these women tried to hide their profiles from their husbands, led to a web that was more difficult to untangle. Eventually, they connected the dots, traced accounts, and tracked phones. With his knowledge of technology, it took some time and manpower, but they got him. I was lucky enough to be involved in this process, but due to privacy reasons and unfortunate NDAs I had to sign to get this interview, I can't say just how they did it. I think it's more so that I don't tell people how incompetent they were and how they should have caught him sooner. But I'm not at liberty to say. I walk across the room, heels clicking on the cold floor, and pull out the chair, hearing the nasty metallic screech as the legs moved across the concrete. As I sat down, I caught Shepard looking at me. It wasn't a bloodthirsty look, wasn't even haunting, it was sad. A look full of despair. I had been searching for my opening line since I scheduled this interview, but it had all escaped me when I saw his face. I was thrown off guard, expecting to see a monster. Rather, I saw a man, a human, someone who easily could be my brother, my friend, anyone's coworker. He was too normal, and that's what scared me the most. It took me a minute to gather my thoughts, and without much thought, I let something loose I had determined should not be my first question. So, 50 kills in 8 months. That has got to be some kind of record. In reply, he just looked up at me. Yes, he said. It's almost impossible. In fact, I'd say it is impossible. So, how'd you do it then? Such an achievement must have a mastermind behind it. I antagonized. This was my tactic, get him to explode. I can't tell you. I didn't do it. Huh. I had forgotten he had tried to claim innocence. Listen, I'm not here for your BS. You're lucky enough to be out of your cell, and once I'm done with you, you're going right back. So appease me here. Give me what you want, and we can chat for a while. Push me away, and back to the hole you go. He sat there, crossed his arms, and pulled his lips in, showing me he wasn't going to talk. What a waste of time. I looked over at the guard, who gestures towards the door, asking me if I wanted to go. As I was about to walk out, an alarm went off. Without a thought, he swiped his badge, pressed the button, and ran out, leaving me in a locked room with no doorknob with this freak. All was going exactly as planned. I looked at Shepard and saw the fear in his eyes. He had no idea what was going on, and I knew he was afraid. He turned back to me and said, "Look, I don't want to hurt you. If something is wrong, we have to get out of here. These guys, they don't mess around. If someone escaped or something, we're screwed. They all saw you come in. They know you're here, and you'll be a target. Call the guard. Get him to get you out of here. If he doesn't come, you'll have to let me out. I can protect you. I never killed those women, and I won't kill you. They'll blame your death on me, and I'll be screwed if I die with another false accusation on my record." Stunned, I looked at him. He looked sincere, his eyes wide and panicked, begging me to believe him. I had him right where I wanted him. "Sorry, I'm not falling for that. Sit down. I want to talk to you. As a matter of fact, I believe that you're innocent, but in no way will I let you go. Instead, I'm going to tell you a story. It's one I'm sure you'll want to hear," I said with a smirk. Confused, he stared back at me with a look that told me to go on. "I know you never had an online dating profile," I began. "In fact, you barely had any online presence, which is what made you so perfect. You see, I need a patsy, someone who would not have many pictures online, so people couldn't look you up. I had enough photos of you from what your volunteer network had shared on their page. Group photos, pictures of you smiling while building homes for the poor. It was too good. And so came to be Barton Shepard. Your real name, of course. You had to be real. I made your profile, and Barton met Sandra. At first, she was nice, but I knew she was cheering. You see, she was my friend. She had told me about how she wanted to leave her husband, all of the nights away she spent with her boss, and it disgusted me. Her husband deserved better, but I couldn't break his heart by telling him his wife was a cheater. No, she'd just tell him I was a liar and then I'd lose him. Instead, I decided she would have to go. In this time of morning, I would swoop in and confront him. She was such a good woman. I'm so sorry she's gone. All of that BS. So, she set up a date with Barton, and she met me there instead. I pretended to have been at that coffee shop by coincidence, and when Barton stood her up, I asked her to join me on my hike. You know the rest. The bloody rock, body in the river. It was all supposed to stop there. But when I saw the look in her eyes, the fear, and felt the power of having her life in my hands, I knew I couldn't stop. I paused, taking in his expression of confusion and shock. Then I went on. I went home and thought about all the other women like Sandra sneaking around behind their husbands' backs. It's not just the men that cheat, Barton. Women can be liars, and quite good ones at that. And this began my journey. Each woman I found with a streak of infidelity became my new target. I was overwhelmed. I was saving these men and their families from being the heartache of learning their wives didn't love them. I allowed them to be eased of their spouses while being able to collect on life insurance and not have a divorce on their records. I allowed them to gain attention and sympathy, and these women, I sent them to God to be judged. Allie, Maxine, Cassandra, I'm sure they will all haunt you. The names that will kill you. You're sick, he screamed. Then he started screaming for the guard and said, I'm sure there's cameras in here, mics, something that will prove me innocent. You sick person, you ruined my life. Shh, I said. No one can hear you, and no one can hear this conversation. Part of my interview terms state that this conversation will not be recorded for privacy reasons, and you interrupted me. Please, let me finish. See, I started writing the articles about you, me, whoever you want to call this killer. I had to sensationalize it. Had to create that fear. I had hoped that cheating woman would stop, but they didn't. So, I had to keep going. It was my civic duty. I took your IP and manipulated the signals. All stuff you wouldn't understand, I know. Pretty soon, everything traced back to you. I just had to wait until you got caught. But damn, these police suck. It took them way too long. I even killed several times a week in hopes to help them. But it took so long. My articles and efforts did little good, but finally, they caught on. When I gave them a list of suspects that includes your name, eventually, they found you. Found the data I had planted, and made their arrests. You know the rest. The trial, the hatred, and the fact that you have no way out. All evidence pointed to you. He was sobbing at this point. Couldn't even look at me. I grabbed his hands and yanked them away from his face. I whipped his chin up and forced him to look at me. I had to tell you before you died, you see. I cannot have this on my conscience forever. I've got to move on, and so do these families. Your death will provide closure for all. You should be happy to die. You're doing your duty, serving your role in God's greater plan, and for that, I thank you. With that, I got up, pressed the button to summon the guard. He was there in a minute, apologizing for having left me, telling me it was a false alarm. I reassured him that it was fine, but was interrupted by Shepard yelling, "Guard, it was her! She did it, not me! I'm innocent, and that person framed me!" I looked at the guard, who had a brooding look for a moment. Worriedly, I felt my hands start to sweat. Did he actually believe him? Then, to my relief, he guffawed loudly and ushered me out of the room, laughing and apologizing to me. I assured him it was all right, and we laughed as we walked down the hall at how absurd it all was. After getting my purse back and being shown out the door, I breathed in the warm summer evening air and chuckled to myself at how stupid they were to let the serial killer loose. That particular Friday at the office was grueling, and all I thought about was getting home to relax on the couch. I exited the highway, then turned off the county road into my neighborhood. A street lined with homes full of families and retirees ending in the cul-de-sac. As I drove onto my street, I rolled down my car window to wave to the local children riding bikes and shooting basketball in the cul-de-sac, and to the couples walking their dogs in the balmy weather. I parked in my driveway, fetched the newspaper, and just took a moment to enjoy the scene. Children laughing and undoubtedly excited about the approaching conclusion of the school year. My elderly next-door neighbor, Mr. Eugene, watering the crepe myrtle that overlooked his exterior cellar doors and manicured flower bed. Squirrels foraging in the widow's pine straw-laden yard across the street. Pop music blasting from the radio of a young woman cleaning her vehicle. Focused runners of all ages passing up and down my road, intermittently glancing at their Fitbits. Little Jack, as most of us called him, berating some older kids over rules of an imaginary game. Loving husbands and wives pulling into their respective driveways, eager for the weekend. It was a convivial neighborhood. It was a neighborhood I was proud to call home. Being single, I learned to cook for myself, and with nothing on my to-do list, I took time that evening to prepare a delicious meal of chicken parm with zucchini and a baked potato. When there was an opportunity to do something, I took it. Since cutting cable, I'd rekindled my love of reading, and my Boeing bookshelves were proof. I had decided to spend the afternoon reading, as the final rays of the sun inked out the details of the distant trees. I leaned on my dining room table for another forkful and leafed through the local newspaper articles. High school graduation dates, op-eds over teacher pay, and analysis over college sports from the sports editor. Then, on page 5, something caught my attention. Statistics this year. I read aloud to myself. 4 missing persons in the Outlier as the newest reports for missing woman, bringing the total to 7, an unprecedented number in the area. I set the paper down and stirred my leftover noodles drenched in red sauce, knowing those women deserved better. I couldn't believe it was on page 5. Something so traumatic for the families of the missing, including those of the community, should get more attention. more publicity, so those poor, helpless women could be found, not sequestered in a trivial corner of page 5. Those women had families. Those women had friends. Those women were loved. 7. My God, I repeated in horror. Then my dining room was painted in blue, strobing back and forth in waves of color and extingency. My bay windows gave me a good view of the scene unfolding outside Mr. Eugene's house. A pair of patrol cars with rolling blue lights, officers hesitatingly waiting outside, an ambulance being stuffed with a loaded gurney. I joined a few other nosy neighbors on the sidewalk and approached the busy lawn, which was still wet from my neighbor watering his plants. One of the female officers approached the small, fretful crowd. "Ma'am, what happened?" a crowd member asked. "We think maybe a heart attack, but we aren't sure." "Is Mr. Eugene dead?" somebody asked flatly. "Heavens, no. He's been a chatterbox since we got here. He made the emergency call himself. They're taking him to the hospital for tests, but hopefully he'll be okay." The crowd became less tense. "But there is one thing," the officer added. "He kept going on about his bird, feeding it, watering it, birdcage maintenance. He was admitting about finding someone to take care of it for a few days until he gets back from the hospital. So, is anyone interested?" All responses were answered in the negative. "I can't. I have 2 cats. My dog would chase it around the house. I'm not stinking up my house with a bird. No thanks. I don't know the first thing about pet birds." Knowing the old man had no children or immediate family, I expected the bird would be taken to a humane society, which would crush Mr. Eugene's spirits and chances of full recovery. All the neighbors wanted him back to his healthy, gracious self, including me. I had no other pets and plenty of free time. When there was an opportunity to do something, I took it. So, I raised my hand above the crowd. "I'll do it." Because I turned on every light, including the lamps. Its gray plumage in layers of alternating white edges along the body gave the African gray parrot a mystical, almost ghost-like appearance against the white painted walls of my living room. I watched it hop along the arched perch inside of the birdcage that some officers and I removed from Mr. Eugene's vacant house, along with the bird toys and a container of food. I was unaware of any names, so I called it Stormy. It was a name I picked due to its murky color and unfortunate reason for being in my company, and since it would be with me for several days, I felt it was my right to call it what I wanted. I watched Stormy preen, dropping its head into the blanket of feathers, then stroking its bill between the layers before shaking several feathers loose. I watched with an intense fascination. Stormy reciprocated with a twitching of its head and flashes of those pale amber eyes at me one at a time. I lounged on the couch and read some, occasionally looking up past the prose to inspect the parrot, bobbing his head and listing back and forth for attention. I obliged by postponing my book and stroking my new pet along its head and back, then went to bed early. It must have been near sunrise when I heard the man inside my home. The unfamiliar voice woke me in an instant, and I sprang from my bed directly into the closet where I fetched my revolver. With my eyes well adjusted from the darkness of the sleep, I followed the white outlines of the hallway walls, stepping past the basement door and guest bedroom, gliding my hand along the walls, being careful not to accidentally slide any frames off the nails, then staggered cautiously towards the strange voice. I listened for footsteps or breathing, or any sign that the intruder was approaching, but all was quiet, until the voice boomed loudly from the living room. "Breakfast time! Breakfast time!" I studied the dark room for movement, but it only came from the pale flutterings inside the cage. The same phrase boomed again when I switched on the lamp. Stormy hopped, mirthful and excited, along the perch and called out the phrase again. I set the revolver on the table and let out a chuckle at the situation. I had completely forgotten that birds, especially the African gray parrot, could mimic human voices. Stormy called out that phrase again. The clock read 5:30, and I deduced that Mr. Eugene, in his slackened post-retirement routine, awoke and fed his bird in the early morning. Each day, and since the old man had not been around, the bird took it upon himself to demand its routine not be interrupted. I filled the bracketed cup inside the cage with fruit pellets and left Stormy to eat while I got ready. As I walked down the hallway, I heard my new friend squawk another phrase, but I couldn't make it out. It was either, "Can you see me?" or "Can you help me?" After enjoying my coffee in the company of Stormy, I left my home to complete the day's errands. I shopped around in the mall for several hours looking around for a potential birthday gift for my mother. Because of my relative closeness to the furniture store, I browsed the couches, but nothing appealed to my taste. I enjoyed a light lunch of a club sandwich and chips at a deli downtown, then made a stop at the grocery store to purchase all the necessary ingredients for my meal prep plan that week. It was almost 3 o'clock by the time I returned home, burdened by a slew of stuffed plastic sacks looped around each arm. I lumbered past the foyer and into my kitchen, where I began arranging the groceries in their proper places. In the focus of my task, the high-pitched elocution of Stormy's greeting went unnoticed at first until the verbal bird enunciated again. "Help me, please. Help me, please." "What's wrong?" I called half-heartedly. "Are you still hungry?" "Help me, please. Help me, please. Call the police. Missing Jada. Missing Jada." I stopped organizing my canned vegetables. My worry of what order the boxes of pasta best fit into the cabinet melted away. The thoughts of my future supper vanished. My short-stay guest had my full attention, although, without the proper cadence and rhythm of a human, Stormy was clearly mimicking the statements of a female. Stormy called out again, "This is Jada and Amanda. God, help, police, God, we're prisoners." I approached the gray bird in a somber manner, as those phrases and words, although sometimes jumbled incoherently, were spouting from its beak. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The pleads of assistance and mercy from a woman being transmitted and filtered through a veiled conveyances right into my living room. Much like itself, that bird, perched inside its thin metal prison, bore the remarks of someone trapped, alone, scared. Birds only repeat what they have heard, but could it be believed? Could Mr. Eugene have imprisoned those missing women, and their cries had become stored into his pet bird? Stormy repeated the phrases again, and an evocation ripped through me like lightning. I ran to my dining room table and scattered the pile of newspapers out in the desperate hopes that my memory was inaccurate. I was proved wrong. I scanned the lines of text in the article I'd read the previous day about the missing woman, and found the names of the 2 latest victims, Jada and Amanda. That night, I remained restless. I laid in my bed for an hour before discerning my night would be one without rest. The bird mimicked what I heard, and repeating it to me before Mr. Eugene reclaimed his pet was a stroke of luck. Mr. Eugene, the comely neighbor who actually held women against their will. Mr. Eugene, the sick psychopath who fooled the neighborhood, including me. Thanks to Stormy, I knew I had an opportunity to show the neighborhood a serial killer lived amongst them, and he would be tried for his crimes. When there was an opportunity to do something, I took it. The crimson wash of the sunrise overwhelmed the neighborhood, and light poured like streams of wine out of the spaces between the distant oaks. I watched the sunrise, weary and panting, until the officers arrived. I was sitting on the steps of Mr. Eugene's porch when I beckoned them to what I'd found. They passed by and entered the exterior cellar doors that were covered in ominous shadows from the overhead crepe myrtle. Even over the whine of my sobbing, I could hear them curse and vomit at the scene underground. The stench, the blood, the 7 bodies, the proof. After the initial shock and arrival of other officers in droves into the street, blocking some residents from exiting their driveways, the female officer from 2 days earlier pulled me aside to question me from the ballooning crowd. I explained the credit should be given to Stormy, the hero bird who gave up his master for the betterment of mankind and justice. I explained how after hearing the bird's repeat of cries of distressed woman, I suspected Mr. Eugene's involvement in the missing woman's cases. I explained how the names of the birds called out matched those in the newspaper. I told her that throughout the night, I broke into my neighbor's home using an expired credit card and searched for any sign of them, but found nothing until I spotted the door to his cellar. Using a pair of bolt cutters, I entered the underground chamber, despite my knowing that it was illegal to do so. I told the officer that my hopes of finding the woman alive were my reasoning for doing this illegal activity without calling the authorities first. I wanted to save them as quickly as possible. I was too late. To my surprise, the officer admonished me. She explained that a citizen breaking and entering on grounds of advice of a parrot has the potential to ruin any legal case against Mr. Eugene and his murdering rampage. She spit after saying his name. She cursed him, then cursed me for not calling authorities immediately. It could be my fault he gets off, she said. I hung my head in shame and sobbed harder. After the initial shock of the matter wore off, and the realization of how cruel her reprimand sounded, she lifted my chin. Sir, we need to get this person, and we will. Imprisoning, raping, murdering these women, only to be found innocent over some technicality? Hell no. After what I've seen, even with your irresponsible behavior, Mr. Eugene will not be let off by a jury. This person will pay for what he's done. Before I returned to my house, the officer rescinded her earlier remarks and apologized, then commended my valorous effort, even though I muddied up the overall case. But she reassured me with the overwhelming evidence of 7 bodies, some victims heavily decomposed, others bruised with ligature marks on the wrists and ankles. A guilty verdict was definite. 2 victims, she said, were recently murdered and mutilated. She presupposed Mr. Eugene killed them like the others, and maybe the work of the dismemberment was too much for his heart to handle. I wiped my eyes and agreed to make a testimonial statement the following day at the department, then shuffled down the sidewalk. Once inside my house, I cleaned my face and arms, then made a cup of coffee and fixed some toast. Stormy watched, placid and friendly, as I took my breakfast down the hall and into the basement, where once the door was open. The smell was still apparent. Down the steps I went crunching on my toast until arriving at the dirt floor. The shackles nailed into the walls and support beams still had dried blood on them, and the dirt from freshly dug graves still smelled ripe of decay and rot. I bit my toast and sipped my coffee, wondering how much bleach and lye it would take to rid my basement of the smell, or if a layer of concrete would be the best option. I swigged the dregs of my coffee. New room. Now, room temperature, and no longer masking the odor of the lower level, and wondered how I could dispose of the wheelbarrow I used to transport the lucky 7 from my house to Mr. Eugene's cellar. Could I find a dumpster in town? Maybe behind a factory or large retail store, where it would get overlooked with the other assorted profusions. Perhaps I could clean it up nicely and sell it at the next neighborhood garage sale. My muscles ached, and my back was tension-strained from all the work the night before, so I rested on an old crate near the wall. A drop of water hit my foot from above, and I noticed a small vent protruding slightly from the wall, about 6 feet above me, and from it came a noise. I stood atop the crate and listened. It was stormy. The message was gargled at first, but the closer my ear drew to the vent, the clearer it became. Breakfast time. Breakfast time. My act of talking into the vent stopped my new pet's demands. It was proof of how my prisoner got her message out into my living room, obviously believing the calling and outlandish statements of Stormy were from a human, a possible savior. Once I returned to the living room, and the hungry comportment of Stormy was clear, along with the squawking and repetition of the phrase. I filled his cup with fruit pellets and then washed my coffee cup in the sink. Outside, between the slats of the window blinds, the sun had arrived above the treetops and washed the neighborhood in light. Police were still scurrying around the area, telling my neighbors to return to their homes and waving media away until more information was released. It was a convivial neighborhood. It was a neighborhood I was proud to call home. But I knew my neighbors would be tentative from now on, as they should be. They had all befriended a serial killing who appeared cordial and hospitable in the neighborhood, only to torture and kill a helpless, beloved woman in his spare time. I skimmed the newspapers strewn across my table once more, feasting on the joy of each name and description, before tossing them in the wastebasket. 7. My God. I repeated in horror. It only seems like yesterday when I brought the first one back. Time does fly, doesn't it, Stormy? Poor innocent Mr. Eugene, the man who would be arrested while still in the hospital bed, and would undoubtedly spend the last years of his life in prison, or at least in court. Poor innocent Mr. Eugene, the man with a pet that heard my prisoner's calls from the basement, which upon screeching out its understandings gave me the opportunity to attribute my neighbor to the killings that I thoroughly enjoyed committing. When there was an opportunity to do something, I took it. Isn't it funny how some people become notorious? The Zodiac Killer has 5 confirmed kills, but he had a nose for publicity. Everyone knows the Son of Sam, but Berkowitz only killed 6 people. A serial killer in an urban area is big news. Notorious, an evil legend. One operating in a rural area though, not huge news. Especially if he ever gets tagged with a catchy name. If reporters can't get a direct flight there for breathless media coverage, well, who wants to connect? And if the guy is already dead, so there isn't ever going to be a trial, no one hears about it beyond the local paper, and it probably doesn't get more than a few days of coverage. I have painstakingly gathered documents about the serial killer. I know that the threat is real, and I know that with Detective Gaskin gone, that no one is still looking for him. There is no one but me who can connect the dots, no one who will ensure that the public knows the danger they are in. I only hope this becomes public so the world knows. Detective Gaskin figured something was up before anyone else. The disappearances were random, spread across a large rural area with plenty of people living secluded lives. He didn't even have jurisdiction over most of them, but he started pushing the county to investigate them as connected. His notes make clear he didn't get any traction. Denise, 37, reported missing by mother after 2 weeks of unreturned phone calls. No signs of forced entry at house. Car, identification, and money all missing. Other belongings still present at house. Michael, 28, reported missing by coworker after 2 weeks of unreturned phone calls. Possible sign of forced entry along back door. Wallet, keys, and all belongings appear to be present in the house. Shauna, 22, reported missing after she did not return to college following summer break. Parents last spoke to her day before she was moving out of temporary apartment and driving back to school. All belongings missing. Lyle, 45, reported missing by business partner after missing 2 standing meetings. Car, wallet, and identification missing. Search of house met with negative results. It goes on like this. 37 people missing over the course of 4 years. Some several hours away by car. Detective Gaskin was the only one who saw the pattern. I wonder if he could have convinced others. If it would have helped. If some of those people wouldn't have been taken. If more than 6 would have survived. Excerpt of interview with Denise, surviving victim, by Detective Gaskin. Are you comfortable? Yes. Thank you for moving me into an office with windows. Of course, I understand how a windowless room must feel after everything. So, where was I? You were summarizing your 8 months of captivity. Yes, it was awful. He would appear suddenly, wearing a mask, doing unspeakable things. Sometimes, I would hear someone next to me being tortured for hours straight. Other times, none of us would have food or water for days, and wouldn't hear from him. How many other captives died during your captivity? 12? 14? Those are the ones I remember. The loudspeakers would come to life, and we'd be told that we were to bury one of our own. The doors would open remotely, and we'd walk out to the courtyard. There would be shovels. He never came out during those times. We had to bury the body and then return to our cells and close the doors. Did you ever try to run? Yes, one of the other survivors. The one who lost 2 of his fingers. Michael? Yes, Mike. The first time we were let out, he made a run for the wall, but a gunshot rang out and he stopped. The next time I saw him was when he was missing 2 fingers. None of us tried to run after that. Retracing the notes makes clear that Gaskin was unrelenting. 3 states were sending him every missing person report they had. He was working cases in his off hours, on weekends, on vacations, tracking back and forth, getting descriptions, suspicious vehicles, parking tickets, composite sketches. He had started drinking more, feeling that he was letting these people die. This killer was something different, a ghost in the mist, always a step ahead of him. And in all of this, Gaskin never caught a big break. There were too many miles of road to cover. The killer was too careful. Gaskin would later guess that he never let down his guard. He was always ready to call off a target if things seemed suspicious. Anything that seemed amiss would send him off. He never got complacent. How many people were saved from him because of a random car, because a cop happened to drive by at the right time? Call transcript. Dispatch. 911, what's your emergency? I'm sorry, I know I was trespassing, but something is wrong. Sir, what is your emergency? I was scouting this old building I heard about from a friend, looking to take some pictures of an old creepy building, and there were people. I'm sorry, people? People screaming for help. They said they were starving. Where? I don't want to get in trouble. Just go here. There's an old factory out there. Call ends. This call was made from a payphone 35 minutes from the compound. No witness saw the caller. Article in the Daily Ledger. House of Horrors found. Killer believed dead. Police searching an old factory in the town found a horrible scene on Friday, when 6 people starving in cells were rescued. Authorities believe dozens more may be buried on the grounds. Police say that the macabre scene is the work of a serial killer who has been the subject of a previously unknown task force headed by Detective Gaskin of the town's police department. The case received a break this weekend when an anonymous 911 caller exploring the building heard cries from the prisoners and reported it to authorities. Lyle Thomas, 45, of the town, was found dead in a residence nearby. It is believed he was the killer, and he appears to have died of natural causes in the last several weeks. No motive for the crimes have been announced. This is a developing story that will be updated. Gaskin didn't handle the abrupt end of the case well. He knew Lyle Thomas hadn't been seen in months. In fact, he was listed as a potential victim. A man with some means, vanishing without a word or a charge on his credit card, had to be connected to the disappearances. But he thought he was a victim. Still, Gaskin couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that it all felt too neat. He asked for money to continue digging, but he was shot down. Ever since the department faked their creation of some task force to hide the fact that they had ignored Gaskin's warnings for years, it should have been clear that he was never going to get the answers he wanted. He got a commendation and a warning to let it go, that the case was closed. So his drinking habit became a full-fledged problem. He would sit at home at night, poring over the file and looking for what was missed, listening to the 911 tape and trying to figure out what he wasn't seeing. He started calling in sick and seemed disheveled whenever he left his house. His death 6 months later didn't really shock anyone. They all knew he had struggled. Everyone said it was a feeling he could have done more that led him to put the gun to the side of his head. That wasn't really it though. Within a year, all 6 survivors were missing or dead. Denise, Michael, Chris, Alyssa, Emily, and Kathy. Alyssa, Emily, and Kathy died under suspicious circumstances, hit-and-run car accidents, overdoses at home, despite previously showing no signs of substance abuse. Denise and Michael vanished without a trace. Chris was murdered in what appeared to be a home invasion gone wrong. All 6 victims vanish. Police notes: 6 individuals recovered alive from abandoned factory. Individuals have been kept alive for between 2 and 12 months. All the individuals had been tortured in some way, with one male individually having had 2 fingers removed. Beatings and other abuse were apparently normal. All the victims bear numerous scars and will be referred for psychological counseling after they are released from the hospital. 22 bodies have been found buried on the grounds thus far, and more bodies are expected to be recovered. Based on interviews with the victims, there seems to be a little correlation with how long a prisoner stayed in the makeshift prison, or why some were kept alive much longer than others. Another adult male believed to be the perpetrator was found in a makeshift residence inside the old factory. He was in good health and bore no signs of the torture that the other victims did. He is believed to have died between 3 and 4 weeks prior to the discovery from natural causes, based upon the level of decay. You see, the killer knew that he had over. It was time to move on and avoid being caught. Still, how does one slip away? After so long at the factory, how can someone make the perfect escape? So, Lyle Thomas is taken, kept alive, never tortured, and then killed and left to rot. He'll be remembered as the murderer. Detective Gaskin is shot in his home in a manner to make it look like a suicide. The man was so drunk he slept through it. Poor old Detective G never knew the truth. There have to be survivors, but they were dealt with later. No loose ends. None of them stayed in the local area, not after what they went through. They scatter and disappear, and their disappearances were never connected. It feels empty though, and that's why I've turned to you, No Sleep. I want you to know what I've done, to know I'm still out there. I want people to fear me, to understand the horrible things I have done, and to know that I'm still out here, hunting. My problem is that I was too good. Everyone saw what they wanted to see. They wanted to believe that the monster was dead. They didn't want to fathom a world in which the killer tortured himself to make sure he would be viewed as a victim, where he recorded a gunshot to ensure that no one would ever try to escape after his first fake attempt. They didn't want to fathom a world where the killer would cut off 2 of his own fingers to ensure he got away. Thanks for watching, Wolfpack. If you want to submit your story, my email and subreddit will be in the description below. And also, if you're not subscribed, please do if you want. And don't forget to like and comment as well. Have beautiful nightmares. And I will see you next time.